Well, the front line has been about fighting against the COVID-19 in the clinics and in the ICUs. China at large has been also facing the social and economic impact caused by the pandemic. Thankfully, the country is not fighting alone. The New Development Bank has issued a 5 billion yuan in coronavirus combating bonds to China, aiming to help China cope with the enormous medical spendings on controlling the pandemic. Earlier, I talked to Leslie Massdorp, Vice President of the New Development Bank. He explained in detail how the NDB is helping emerging economies, including China, to overcome both medical and financial difficulties. Leslie, good to see you. Let me start by asking you, how is the New Development Bank trying to help the emerging economies who are all struggling right now with the COVID-19?
New Development Bank has looked at the current crisis and decided to invoke a clause which allows us to do emergency assistance programs. And this loan is focused on helping China to deal with the unexpected expenditures in the healthcare system, linked to the three most affected regions in China, that's Hebei, Henan, as well as Guangdong. So the bank provided this $1 billion loan to China to help with medical supplies, procurement of protective gear for frontline health workers, procuring more ventilators, and everything associated with dealing with the pandemic. So we recognize that whilst our core mandate is building infrastructure, bricks and mortar infrastructure, building dams and power stations and ports and rail lines, etc., right now our member countries are confronted with a historic public health emergency. So we are providing emergency assistance loans to our member countries. We started with China, and we are about to engage in similar discussions with South Africa, as well as with India and Brazil.
Okay, I see. It seems to be a great idea. However, Leslie, as you may know, we also understand that AIIB has also started a similar project providing healthcare infrastructure funding for China, particularly in the municipalities of Beijing and Chongqing. Tell me more about that.
As you can imagine, the scale of the financial and fiscal support required is enormous. By definition, therefore, multilateral development banks will work in a coordinated fashion, okay, to do complementary efforts so that we don't all do the same thing. So our support is to these provincial governments. The provinces may decide, based on the needs, to devote some of those expenditure to particular municipalities that are most affected. But multilateral banks, as you know, Tianwei, we are all working in the same space. We work for the public good. We are development finance institutions. So we are in daily, in regular contact with Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. I will be speaking to the CFO in a matter of hours. So we work in a complementary fashion. There's no sort of competitive dynamic between these.
Different emerging economies are going through this COVID-19 at the different stages. So what is the best way to make sure resources can be used the most efficient way?
I think, as you correctly pointed out earlier on, the first priority is the public health emergency. We've got to contain the spread of this pandemic. We have to make sure that developing countries have access to the kinds of medical supplies, ventilators, respirators, everything required to deal with COVID-19. However, when it comes to targeted economic interventions to deal with the economic crisis that is likely facing us now, because the world economy, everybody assumes now, baseline assumption, is going to go into recession. So now I think the principal focus has to be on preserving jobs. Keeping people in employment is the #1 priority. So all of the economic interventions that are being thought of right now has to be focused on alleviating the burdens on businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses. You know, the mom-and-pop store out there, the people who employ 10, 20, 50, and 100 people. Those are the businesses that sustain a modern economy, providing services. So protecting people's jobs is the safest and surest way for us to be resilient and to emerge out of this crisis.
Mr. Massdorp, we are facing a reality That is more complicated than we could ever imagine. You talk about the pandemic, unprecedented in our lifetime at least, and then also the economic recession, possibly also in a scale that we have never seen before. Plus the already existing complicated geopolitics. It makes everything more than complicated. So, Mr. Massdorp, what does it mean for multilateral financial institutions like yours, the new development bank, at this point?
Multilateral banks have been set up with public good objectives. Our mandate is around development. We look at sustainable development as our core objective. So we have the advantage that we look at the world through very long-term lenses. We're not like a commercial bank like ICBC or Goldman Sachs or Standard Chartered who have to deliver profits to the shareholders every quarter and every financial year so that they can distribute dividends so shareholders can see a return on their money. We have the advantage that we were set up with long-term objectives. So it's exactly at the moment like this where multilateral banks, the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, New Development Bank, all of us have been set up specifically to deal with crises of this nature, because we can take longer-term perspectives on the world. And then secondly, and very importantly, we have very high, some of the highest credit ratings in the world, which means that we are the most credit-worthy, we are some of the safest institutions. We can raise money in moments of crisis. Give you one example. About 2 weeks ago, the New Development Bank issued a bond in China. Although all of us are scattered around the world right now, we were able to raise 5 billion renminbi in the Chinese domestic capital market at very favorable pricing. Everything was done virtually. We were able to get all of our approvals from the regulators. So the bank has an enhanced mandate in moments of crisis, like in 2008, when the world went through a deep financial and global economic crisis. Multilateral banks significantly increased their lending. So our thinking caps are on. People are working 24/7 to come up with, looking for new ideas of how best we can be effective in this moment of crisis.
During the interview, Massdorp weighed in on some of the rumors and conspiracies which propped up with the outbreak. He believes the priority for the moment is to confront these rumors head-on and broaden education on the pandemic and its economic impact. On the one hand, the world has to make sure no rumors, no wrong understanding, particularly about science, has been circling around. On the other hand, the world has to concentrate on the real work of development and guard against pandemic and also the recession. This is a very complicated job. I want to invite your thoughts and wisdom on this.
You're spot on, Tianwei. Right now, I think the first order priority is to confront head-on the fake news and disinformation out there. Secondly, is to broaden an education campaign around the most appropriate ways to deal with this health as well as the oncoming economic crisis. As you know, there are many people now using the spread of disinformation to sort of suggest that because the pandemic started in China, that China is now somehow benefiting from the economic chaos that is unfolding in the rest of the world. I think it is very important to confront those head-on. But more importantly, now is the time to base our decisions on science, on scientific data, information, and exchange. We can only deal with this health crisis by listening to the doctors and the epidemiologists and those who understand viruses and who studied it all their lives, right? We cannot listen to people who have views about things that they are not educated in. In a similar way, in dealing with the economic crisis now, it must be based on scientific evidence, it must be based on data, it must be based on historical experience, how to confront this. But as I say, China has a critical role to play because it has emerged reasonably unscathed economically at this stage from the pandemic.
Mr. Massdorp, let me ask you also about these emerging economies, which you are very familiar with, you deal with every day. You know, China now somewhat coming out of the fire, but still have to be very cautious because nobody knows whether there will be resurgence. Just by signs, we do not know much. Then India, a huge population, 1.3 billion, and we see in some part of the slums, for example, there are already some severe situations of signs of pandemic. Then South Africa, where you are based right now, we also see cases are increasing. The African continent is also a place of attention. So, Mr. Massdorp, it seems that there are crises everywhere. How to coordinate?
We are reliant right now, Tian, on policymakers, people in leadership positions in each of these emerging markets to take stock of the situation that confront them in a realistic manner. Fortunately for Africa, and this is a very important sort of starting point, the pandemic came quite late, having reached a climax in China, having peaked in places like Italy, in Spain, the rest of Europe, United Kingdom, United States. So Africa, fortunately, the pandemic has only really sort of hit the continent in the early parts of March. So people have seen the extent of the public health crisis and how hospitals were overrun in many parts of the world. So immediately, countries have adopted social distancing policies, lockdowns at great expense to the economy. So the governments in Africa, including here in South Africa, we are currently under lockdown, a 21-day lockdown, where everything has been shut down. So people are unable to make a living by going to work, selling their goods, or going to the factories to produce. But we all recognize that this is what is required of us right now. So there's a collective pain, collective suffering all together. With respect to the coordination, I think the first, once we have emerged out of the health crisis, we can then begin to, in a more coordinated fashion amongst emerging markets, using the global platforms like the G20 and others, to develop strategies in a coordinated manner. We also have one of the biggest crises in the energy markets. Oil prices have never been this low. So in Africa, we have countries like Angola, like Gabon, like Nigeria. 85% of their revenues come from oil.
So it seems that we have to deal with all of these crises one by one and all at the same time. It certainly needs a lot of skills and capacity. Mr. Massdorp, before we go, I want to ask you a final question. What do you think this crisis has taught us so far?
One of the aspects that the crisis brings, that the crisis shines a brighter light on, are the internal contradictions in each society. For example, what the crisis has done, it is brought into sharper focus the inequalities that we have. I mean, as you know, some people live in wealthy suburbs, others live in densely populated, overcrowded townships and slums, right? Seeing those images on television now of villages without access to basic water and sanitation and so on, looking at how the struggles of rural people in the rural areas disconnected from mainline services. When we emerge post this crisis, we can never return back to normal, Tianwei. We cannot make these forms of inequality permanent features of our society. Now is the time to deal with those contradictions in society, and when we emerge after the crisis, we need to solve those problems, improve the quality of clinics and hospitals in the rural areas, have better housing for the people in these densely populated urban areas, and deal with the levels of inequality.